I also wanted to thank Kathleen Turco for inviting me to join you this afternoon. Wait. You said it would work if I just pressed this right button here. There we go. Okay. I'm very pleased to be joining you this afternoon. When I think about the work that we do within the Office of Federal Financial Management at OMB, we have a lot of touch points with the acquisition community, and I think we share the common objective of proper stewardship of taxpayer dollars. And as we'll go through the conversation today and we talk about some of the specific initiatives that we're working on within my part of OFFM within OMB, you'll see that finance and acquisition are committed to the same cause, and that we're supporting the same objectives and working on some similar projects and shared projects. So I'm grateful for the partnership, the strong partnership, and the solid working relationship that we've developed between financial management and the acquisition community. I want to talk about 5 key initiatives today: administrative savings, financial systems, improper payments, grants management, and federal spending transparency. And while technically the Office of Federal Financial Management may be the team lead on these efforts, we recognize that these initiatives transcend the financial management community, and their success really is dependent upon active participation, input, and engagement, not just from the acquisition community, but also the IT community, program offices, and private sector as well. And there's a common theme that you'll see across these 5 different areas, and that is they're all focused on reducing waste, fraud, and abuse, and they're all focused on maximizing the impact of our limited financial resources. Wanted to start just by giving you a backdrop on what's going on across the federal budget landscape. And as we talk about our quest to eliminate wasteful spending, it's important to recognize that the stakes have never been higher. And sequester, which was once an abstract concept, actually has moved to a current reality. And what we've seen is that the days of budgets increasing year after year are long behind us. And today, I would say that many agencies would be glad to have their budget remain flat from one year to the next. And a colleague of mine once joked or remarked recently that, flat is the new up in terms of the world of budgeting. But I think that really kind of demonstrates the point that we're in a new normal here, where the days of budgets increasing year over year are behind us, and who knows when they'll come back. So it really creates an urgent challenge for all of us in these tough fiscal times in terms of minimizing the impact of the reductions that we're seeing through sequester, minimizing their impact on core agency mission, and maximizing our ability to identify and eliminate unnecessary spending. And if there's one word that I think is an important success factor in our ability to do that, it really is all about collaboration. And for those of you who worked in the federal government, you know firsthand that it's virtually impossible to affect any meaningful change unilaterally. And in order to be successful, you really are going to have to work collaboratively and to coordinate across, not just across the mission support functions like finance and acquisition and IT and human capital, not just with your program office counterparts, but also it takes collaboration and coordination with private industry as well. And we recognize that the private sector is an important and valuable partner in this process. So let me start by talking about administrative spending and start by defining what we're talking about anyway. When we talk about administrative activities, we're talking about professional services contracts, supplies, printing, rent, travel, things like that. And let me start by sharing my own experience from working on the private sector. And I remember when we were working in the private sector, there was a laser-like focus in terms of administration and overhead, and really understanding what that spend is and what's driving that spend, and trying to bring down that spend as much as possible, recognizing that dollars that you are spending on things like travel and rent and supplies and things like that, they come at the expense of profit. I would say that we don't have that same type of profit motivation in the federal sector, but we do recognize that there's still a trade-off that's being made. And the dollars that we're spending on that type of administrative activity are dollars that are coming at the expense of either deficit reduction or dollars that are coming at the expense of support for higher priority programs like education, job training, community development, public safety. So again, you don't have that same type of profit motivation that would really drive you to reduce your administrative costs, but you have something that's equally compelling in terms of deficit reduction or support for higher priority programs. The administration has recognized this trade-off, and since 2010, OMB has led the government-wide effort to reduce spending in this area, and the initial target was about $9 billion worth of savings, and I'm happy to say that we've exceeded that target by the end of fiscal year 12, and we came in at $11 billion of savings. And again, those were funds that either helped agencies kind of meet their lower top line constraints, or funds that agencies put towards higher and better use. We're proud of this initial success, but we recognize that there's much more to be done. And our approach for further reductions and further efficiency really is built on a foundation of data sharing and analytics. This actually has become one of my favorite slides, and I think Joe Jordan referenced this topic earlier today. And to me, a picture is worth 1,000 words. And let me explain what's going on here. What you can see is this slide shows one agency and the prices that it's paying for a nearly identical service plan, 400 voice minutes, unlimited text, and unlimited data. And you can see the distribution of prices just for one agency, ranging from a high of $98 a month to a low of $21 a month. And I think that tells a lot in terms of the need for additional discipline and rigor in terms of how we're buying routine goods and services. And as we've been talking, not just within the finance community, but also within the acquisition community, there's been this increasing voice that's growing louder and louder for the need for greater transparency and visibility on what agencies are paying for routine goods and services. Questions come up in terms of what am I paying relative to what others are paying? How do I make sure that I'm getting the best deal for my agency? So as Joe mentioned this morning, we've embraced this whole concept of a prices paid portal where we target specific commodities. We gather data on what agencies are paying for the same item. We identify where the outliers are, and then most importantly, we support agency efforts to renegotiate contracts or leverage other vehicles to get a better price and to reduce our administrative spending at the end of the day. And over time, we want to help folks move away from that $98 price closer to that $21 price. I want to take a minute and talk about financial systems. Federal agencies spend more than $8 billion each year to operate, maintain, and develop financial information systems. And the past approach really has been built on the principle of the uniqueness of each agency and that assumption. And as a result, we've been spending enormous amounts of money developing agency-specific complex ERPs. where the scale and complexity of these implementations often collapses under their own weight because of cost. You see cost overruns, schedule delays, and functionality and performance that never really live up to their initial expectations. In this tight budget environment, I don't think we have the luxury of perpetuating past practice. And as we look, again, to what we see as best in class, and I think we're drawing some lessons learned from not just the private sector, but also from other governments. And I was down yesterday in South Carolina meeting with the National Association of State Comptrollers, and we were talking about shared services at the state level, and more states are really embracing that as a concept. What we're doing is we're changing our operating philosophy as we go forward. And we're recognizing that while agencies may be unique in their mission, when it actually comes back to financial operations and systems, we're probably not as unique as we would like to think we are. And there's probably much more commonality, or there should be much more commonality than what we've recognized in the past. So we're embracing a new approach. And in the coming weeks, OMB will be releasing guidance on how agencies should modernize their financial systems. And we're taking much more of a focus on shared services, and we're mandating shared services as agencies modernize. And we recognize that we don't have the luxury of funding these agency-specific systems where there is significant risk of failure. We just can't be throwing good money after bad anymore. But as we embrace shared services, we recognize that this is not the first time that we've considered this concept. We've taken a run at this in the past. But what we're applying here is some lessons learned in terms of why it may not have worked in the past. And I would say that our observation is that the market, in terms of large agencies working with federal shared service providers, that hasn't always worked as well as it should have in the past. So what we're trying to do is address the shortcomings of the market as we put forward this new approach. So on the supply side, there's a recognition that if we look at the federal shared service providers, they're largely serving smaller agencies, and they have been relatively untested when it comes to larger agencies. We recognize that there's issues in terms of functionality and in terms of capacity that have to be addressed if we truly want to be able to scale up with this concept government-wide. And on the demand side, I think that we recognize that if we're serious about shared services, then we need to be far more disciplined in terms of what agencies are asking for in terms of their requirements, and that we need to be take much more of a standardized approach that recognizes that it really should be agencies bending and being flexible to fit the business processes and requirements being offered by the shared service providers, as opposed to the other way around. I want to take a minute to talk about improper payments. As many folks in this room know, improper payments are payments made to the wrong entity for the wrong amount for the wrong reason. And this chart shows the trend in improper payments and the error rate over time. And you can see that as we got towards fiscal year 2009, we reached the high water mark of 5.4%. Seeing that, the administration recognized that this was a huge problem, and since 2009 has launched a full court press to bring that number down through a series of executive orders and a presidential memorandum on improper payments. And as we've worked with agencies over the past few years, we've seen that number begin to tick down. And by the end of fiscal year 12, we landed at a rate of 4.35%. So that's the good news. However, if you look at the magnitude of total federal spending, when you take that 4.35% and apply it to that base, you still get a big, scary number of $108 billion. So we recognize that there's a lot more work to do, even though we're seeing that error rate trend in the right direction. I want to take a minute just to talk about what is driving that error rate in terms of specific programs. And you'll see the relative distribution of improper payments across some of the key drivers. Medicare fee-for-service represents about 27% of the problem. The Medicaid program represents about 18% of the problem. The Earned Income Tax Credit represents about 12% of the problem, and you can see that UI is coming in there almost at 10%. The good news is that, in fiscal year 12, we actually saw the error rate for these programs notch down a bit. So again, we're kind of seeing a trend in the right direction. But we also recognize that there's some chronic issues in terms of program design and policy issues that need to be addressed if we want to see more of a significant reduction. I want to take a minute to talk about the Do Not Pay program, which was launched in April of 2012 to address this issue of improper payments. And again, it comes back to the whole notion of data sharing and analytics that can be brought to bear on these chronic issues. And what we want to be able to do is to move from a pay and chase model to a model that actually prevents the horse from getting out of the barn in the first place by avoiding the improper payment at the outset. So the way the program works is that we are screening information against basic data sets like the death master file and the excluded parties list system, and over time we'll be adding additional data sets. And we look at two important points at the process. We look at the pre-award process, where before making an award, an agency would look against the Do Not Pay data set to see if the vendor has any issues that are being flagged in those data sets. So in some sense, Do Not Pay is actually a misnomer. You might actually call it Do Not Award. But, and the second step is at the pre-disbursement process, where before we make a payment to an individual or an entity, you look at these same data sets to see if that person is eligible or that entity is eligible for payment. And the way it works is that when you screen against these data sets, it's not definitive. It really just flags the transaction and sends it back to the agency for final disposition. We recognize that there are all different types of circumstances where just because you're hitting against a data set, that doesn't mean that it's not a valid payment. So what we want to do is allow for a lot of agency discretion and judgment in this process, recognizing that there are multiple scenarios where someone might actually be entitled to a payment through this process. But what we're still doing is, again, using basic data sets just to make sure that we're applying the right due diligence before we make payments. For those of you who are familiar with the most recent improper payments legislation, known as IPERIA, which was enacted earlier this year, IPERIA requires that we run all of our payments through the Do Not Pay process, the Do Not Pay system, as of June 1st. So we've got a lot of work between now and June 1st, both in terms of the pre-award element as well as the pre-disbursement function. But we see a tremendous payout at the end of the day, where we've got the potential to avoid billions of dollars of improper payments each year once this program is fully implemented. This is an interesting slide. I'm not going to talk about it. It's basically what I just told you. And this one's not as interesting, so I'm not going to talk about it either. All right. Let's talk about another pretty slide. Grants management priorities. Just give you a sense of the federal landscape on grant spending. Agencies spend about $600 billion in federal grants each year, and I think that's a little bit more than what we spend on contracts now. Contracts is probably right in the low fives. So the challenge for us within the federal government is to ensure that the dollars are being used for their intended purpose, that we're minimizing administrative burden on grant recipients, and that at the end of the day, we're ensuring that the dollars are having a programmatic impact and benefit. And the work that we're doing at OMB, and it is actually part of a larger government-wide effort coordinated through the Council on Financial Assistance Reform, where we've got the largest grant-making agencies represented, part of that body. There are 5 major areas of focus as we look to improve grants management in the federal space. One is our consolidation and reform of the circulars that actually govern grants management. And there are 8 different circulars right now that are overlapping and ambiguous in terms of the guidance that we're giving agencies and grantees. So our focus now is to consolidate those 8 different circulars into a single document that is clear in terms of the policies that should apply to all of the grantees and makes a clear distinction in terms of when you would distinguish among the grantees. So right now, we are in the comment period, which will run through June, but we see this as a major step forward in terms of reducing administrative headache. And I was looking at a statistic yesterday that said that principal investigators spend about 42% of their time working on administrative tasks related to federal grants. And that's time that's being taken away from actually focusing on the work that we're trying to fund. So we're trying to reduce administrative burden, but again, better target risk. And we are seeking public comment, and we think at the end of the day we'll land in a much better place in terms of how well we administer those federal grant dollars. We're also working to standardize business processes and data elements. I read somewhere that I think there are over 700 different forms that we have in the federal grant space. So again, think about what burden that creates, not just in terms of grant recipients, but also folks within the federal agencies who are administering those grants. And we recognize that there's a tremendous amount of improvement there. We'll talk about federal spending transparency in a minute, so I won't get too much into that. But I wanted to highlight 2 other areas real quick, and that is strengthening training and development of our federal grants workforce. And I draw a sharp contrast between what the acquisition community has been able to achieve in terms of the training and the certification and the professionalization of the acquisition cadre. I kind of use that as the model, and when we look at the federal grants workforce, it shows that we've got some additional work to do, and I don't think that we have that same type of cohesiveness, that same type of discipline and rigor to make sure that the folks in our agencies who are managing federal grants, that they have the skills and training and knowledge that they need to administer those grants effectively. So we've embarked upon a major initiative to first identify what that core set of competencies is that all federal grants managers would need, and then to support the agencies in actually providing additional training, and someday perhaps get to a certification stage to make sure that we're applying that same type of discipline and rigor that you in the acquisition community have been applying to your function. And finally, looking at the issue of audit follow-up and resolution. And what we see is that as you have the single audit findings, they often kind of go into the vault and never get the light of day, and we kind of forget about them. And my own experience at FEMA, which is where I was before coming to OMB, I saw that because nobody was looking, the problem just built up over time, and when we finally looked in 2009, we saw that we had more than 1,000 open audit findings that had gone unresolved. So I'd like to think that that situation's not unique across the federal agencies. So what we're doing is bringing a little bit more discipline, a little bit more rigor in terms of understanding what those audit findings are, making sure that we've got better visibility in terms of how they're being resolved over time. And we want to make sure that we're being thoughtful in our approach. And if we've got audit findings that have built up over years and years and years, it's unreasonable to think that we're just going to blitz the problem and close out all of those audit findings. But we really need to be a little bit more thoughtful and strategic in terms of where we're seeing the relative risk and where we think that we'll get the biggest payoff as we begin to tackle those findings. Finally, I just wanted to spend a few minutes talking about federal spending transparency. And the hypothesis here is that if you establish greater visibility on how agencies are spending their money, you'll create a healthy check in the system, and that you'll have greater accountability for federal spending, and you'll be able to do a better job in terms of preventing waste, fraud, and abuse. And I would say that this administration has set a new standard for federal spending transparency. We've got a government-wide website, usaspending.gov, that shows all contract and grant awards for over $25,000. Today, you have information posted on that website that shows who received an award, from which agency, for what amount, and for what general purpose. So we're proud of this initial success, but we recognize that challenges remain. First is the issue of data integrity. Because you have the information on usaspending.gov coming from award systems as opposed to agency financial systems, that creates a lot of risk and potential for error in reporting. And again, I recognize that we're probably in two different places in terms of the acquisition world, where all that information is coming from FPDS, and I think there's a higher degree of confidence in that information relative to the financial assistance world, where you don't have an FPDS equivalent, where the information is flowing in from far more sources across the different agencies. So as we look at the issue of data integrity, we recognize that there are some simple steps that we can put in place. One is built on the concept of having control totals. So if you've got information on usaspending.gov, how is it mapping back to information that you're seeing in financial systems? And the approach is built on some type of validation where you're never going to be able to get that information to match one for one because of issues in terms of timing, issues in terms of how you've cut the population, where if USA Spending is only looking at things above 25,000 and financial systems are going to have the entire universe, you're going to have some differences between the two. But what we're challenging agencies to do is to at least compare the information and to explain at a macro level why you're seeing differences. And we're also challenging agencies to provide an annual assurance statement that speaks to the nature of the internal controls that they have in place to assure the integrity of the information on usaspending.gov. And here we've been careful to strike the right balance. We didn't want to be overly prescriptive in terms of dictating the exact steps in terms of how agencies should get there. We wanted to give agencies a lot of latitude and flexibility. But at the end of the day, we know that we need to kind of raise our game in terms of ensuring the data integrity on usaspending.gov. The second issue where I think we are focused going forward is linking that information, the spending information, back to larger program information to provide the big picture on how much we're spending across key activities. And as we work to standardize a list of program activities across the federal government, which is required by the GIPRA Modernization Act, we'll be able to tag our financial transaction data with that program data to be able to provide users with a better look in terms of where the dollars are going and what we're achieving with those dollars. So as we think about the road ahead on federal spending transparency, there's some key considerations here. One is we can't try to be all things for all people. And when we think about the different types of users here, it's not one size fits all, and that we really need to be sharper in terms of what we're trying to do. And we got to recognize that when we talk about the user, are we talking about the general public? Are we talking about Sunlight groups? Are we talking about agency managers? Are we talking about Congress and the congressional staff? So it really has been kind of like this large amorphous user group, and that we need to recognize that we're not going to be all things to all people here, that we need to recognize that we're never going to be able to anticipate all of the potential questions that will arise among that set of users. And we recognize that, at the end of the day, there's a trade-off. Again, there's a kind of a cost-benefit analysis that comes into play, recognizing that, we could try to continue to build this thing out with more and more information and more functionality, but at what cost? So we're trying to strike the right balance at the end of the day. We're trying to provide a solid and reliable platform of standard spending information that, knowing that users may have to go to additional sources, but it's a good place to start for some basic information. So that pretty much covers the topics that I wanted to cover today, and as I said before, a couple key themes. One is data sharing and analysis really is become, the engine of our program going forward, whether we're talking about improper payments, whether we're talking about administrative spending, much more strategic use of data across the enterprise. And then the second element, again, is recognizing that we're all in this together, and it really is not kind of a financial management focus. It's not an acquisition focus. It's us working together across IT, acquisition, financial management, and then working with the program agencies as well. So I think that we've got a lot of potential for success here, and as I said before, in these tight budget times, now more than ever is time to embrace these initiatives and see further progress. So thank you for the opportunity to join you today. I'll take a couple questions now. Really? Oh, we've got one back there.
Ready?
Ready.
Great. Hey, thanks for coming, Mr. Dong. Appreciate your time. Back to the concept of shared service centers for a moment. I work for small business, and we sort of actively look at what's going on in the federal community regarding the shared service providers and their contractors that undergird those organizations. And looking at the goal of driving agencies to those shared service providers for financial management activities, we've seen over the years that the providers that service those, the contractors that service those providers have expanded their modules, so to speak, to include asset management, acquisition, management services, whatever, so that competition seems to be frozen. So if an agency might have to goes to one of the federal shared service providers for financial management, some of the other things that are attached to that, there's no competition there because the large provider has got all the modules and doesn't really want to speak to small businesses or other providers. What are you guys doing from your perspective to make sure that there is competition under the sheets, so to speak, and to work with those large vendors that are in the financial management realm to see that they do compete some of the other things?
Good question. I mentioned before that we wanted to recognize the lessons learned from this process and make sure that we're not repeating some of the mistakes of the past and going down that same road. We recognize that in order for this model to work, there needs to be a healthy dose of competition in the process, not just among federal shared service providers, but also to be able to allow for private sector providers to play at the end of the day. And we recognize that even though we're taking a federal first policy, that if there's a strong case to be made in terms of going to a private provider, whether it's a case made on cost or quality and performance, we're going to allow that healthy competitive process to make sure that the agency is getting the best value at the end of the day. And I also come back to the demand side for a second. I think one of the things that has kind of limited competition has been, kind of these overly engineered, highly complex requirements that we're seeing from the agencies. So we want to make sure that we're skinnying down those requirements, and we've used a process called homogenization to make sure that if the agency is kind of loading on in terms of what it's asking for, that we're really kind of boiling it down to the basics so that you can allow more people to compete, not just the federal providers, but also to allow for some competition from the private sector as well. So at the end of the day, we want to make sure that it's a level playing field and that we've been as standardized as possible in terms of what agencies are asking for. think we've got a question all the way back there.
All the way in the back. Norm, interesting and a really fascinating topic. It was really interesting to listen to, but I'm curious. I'm going to take it down to a very basic level. Have you all looked at the ability of any one database to be able to at least contain the data that you need to go after to really be able to assess and do the analysis necessary to figure out what you need to figure out?
I think that the conversations thus far have focused on less on creating one master database, but being able to pull from a variety of databases so that information can be seen at an enterprise level. But I don't think it takes kind of throwing everything into one database. It really is kind of how do we draw upon and leverage other information out there. And I kind of use, the DHS example where they've got all these different financial systems across all of their different components. They recognize that it was probably time better spent and resources better spent just to be able to tap into agency data systems or agency financial systems as opposed to creating one system. And I think you kind of get to the same outcome with a lighter footprint.
Thank you for coming out. Investment and return. You talked about savings, about reducing. What about the investment and return part, the role of making sure that when we make an investment, we're getting the return out of it and the savings out of it? A lot of the issue we have, I think, sometimes understand the baseline from which the savings are being generated. Can you talk about that for a moment?
I think it comes back to better tracking and visibility in terms of, all right, if we're spending money on, let's say, on data center consolidation, for example. How are we getting our payout in that? Because I know we're making, again, I'll kind of use the DHS example where we're spending millions of dollars to consolidate data centers within that department. As the CFO and one of the components, I was raising the question, all right, where am I going to see the savings? Because I've been ponying up dollars every year to fund that. So I think, within the financial community, we need to kind of ask those tough questions to make sure that the dollars are being traced through to show the intended result in terms of savings. And then I think that's a responsibility of all of us in terms of good stewardship of the dollars that we're investing in those types of initiatives. So I don't think we can kind of invest and forget about it. I think we need to be diligent in terms of tracing out and banking those savings because we're doing this for a reason.
We have time for one more question. Do we have one more question? Yes, we do.
My name is Tim Rund, and you answered the question that I had about the whether or not private sector could ultimately at some point provide services like a federal shared services center. But the other question I have is, in terms of acquisition vehicles, you've got GWAC-like vehicles for IT-related sort of movements. Do you anticipate new acquisition vehicles for line of business and shared services, financial system transfers? Does that make sense? You've got GWACs effectively that works on IT-related projects. But there really aren't acquisition vehicles similar for line of business transfers to move small agencies or other agencies to a shared services center. How do you build vehicles that help you move line of business financial services from these agencies to a shared services center?
That's a question that we've been looking at as we think about this blueprint and strategy for migrating agencies to a shared service provider. And we recognize that it comes back to the issue of standardization. So if we don't want agencies going all over the place and being undisciplined in terms of what they're asking for, then how are we actually facilitating and driving that process through, some type of standardized vehicle that we have in place that is real clear in terms of what agencies can contract for and what they can't. So I think that will come into play as we go forward, and we're kind of working through that whole concept right now.
That'll do it. Norm, thank you very much.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you very much. Very good.
Enjoy this.
Enjoy it.